This is Join Us in France, episode 402, 402. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France. Everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy. But this week there will not be any news related to travel to France because I am still on vacation, but I'll be back next week. Today I bring you a trip report with Brian Revel about the Napoleon Route in Provence. Brian has visited France many times, and on this trip he was accompanied by his father, and they had a great time exploring the Napoleon Route. Of course, I explained briefly at the start of the episode what is meant by the Napoleon Route. It's really interesting historically, and it'll take you to some of the best parts of Provence. But I do want to take just a second to thank the people who make this podcast possible. They are the ones who buy my products and services listed at my boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique, or become patrons by going to patreon.com/joinus. Patreon is Patreon, join us, no spaces or dashes. Merci beaucoup. And if you'd like to receive my newsletter, go to joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. Bonjour, Brian Revel, and welcome to Join Us in France.
Bonjour. Enchanté.
Enchanté as well. Lovely to talk to you. Today we're going to talk about a trip that you took in France, and you've taken many trips in France, and I'm sure this will come up in our conversation. But your theme for this trip was the Napoleon Route, or at least part of your theme for the trip. And this is the story of Napoleon trying to regain power in 1815 after being forced to abdicate and his exile in Elba. Now, Elba is a little island in the Mediterranean. It's close to Italy, between Italy and Corsica. At any rate, Napoleon was able to organize an escape by rallying between 2,000 and 3,000 men and getting on a ship, and they regained the coast of France and landed at Golfe-Juan, which is what it was called at the time. Usually it's called Antibes-Golfe-Juan, and is very close to Cannes. So typically the Napoleon route starts in Cannes and goes all the way to Grenoble. So Napoleon wanted to get to Paris to topple Louis XVIII as soon as possible, but he had to avoid royalist troops along the way, so he didn't. Sometimes they had to bifurcate a little bit. The route takes you from the Mediterranean all the way to Grenoble in the Alps, and it's really spectacular because the landscapes are ever-changing and often really breathtaking. The big hits are, and I'm going to rattle off a bunch of names, but I'll put them on a map for you if you look at the show notes. It's the village of Castellane in the Verdon. You have Tauleanne, Senez, Barrême, Chabrieres, Sisteron, Gap, and all the way up the Rhone. And since it's all tied to the steps of this fallen emperor making his way back to Paris to reclaim what he saw as his rightful place, it makes for a great story. All right. Now, the authentic way to retrace the steps of Napoleon is to walk it, or parts of it. There is a GR, which is a grande randonnée, a trail, between Castellane and Sisteron. It's called the GR 406, so JR 406. But if you drive it, the views are also spectacular, especially if you also include the Route des Grandes Alpes, which takes you through all these breathtaking places that you see on the Tour de France on TV, right? So it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous area. And Napoleon and his men, they walked between Cannes and Grenoble, and then they rode in various carriages all the way to Paris, and the trek took 3 weeks. There you go. The intro is done. Brian, when did you take this trip?
Well, it's been a while now. It was 10 years ago. My mother had passed away a couple of years before, and this was sort of a way to kind of get my dad out of depression. It was like, come on, Dad, let's go for a trip and take him someplace that I'm passionate about, which is France, and particularly about the south of France that I had previously discovered. So we went to Nice. We flew to London and then connected and flew straight into Nice and spent a couple of days in Nice before I rented a car. and got out of Dodge, as it were, and headed up towards La Route Napoleon. And we didn't do the whole thing. We didn't go all the way to Grenoble. We only went part way. But we went through, I think, some of the most incredible geography and geology, frankly, in the lower Alps region as we made our way from Grasse up towards the Plateau de Valensole, which is just not too far from Musee Saint-Marie. And I know that you did a really, really fantastic interview with somebody who had been to Musee Saint-Marie, which was the inspiration for me giving you a call and saying, hey, how about a little bit more from that part of the world?
Because on the podcast, we really haven't talked that much about kind of what I call real Provence, which is the north end of Provence. Because most people, in my head, I split up Provence into really clear, separate things. You have the Riviera, which is, along the coast. Then you have what I call Roman Provence, which is all these towns that were heavily influenced by Romans, and that's down to Arles, Nîmes, and goes up to Orange and all that. And then you have the scenic villages, the cliffside villages, the hilltop villages. But you also have the north end, the Mont Ventoux and all of that. So we haven't really talked about that area that much on the podcast. So this is a great opportunity. And I thank you for telling us. And the fact that you did it 10 years ago doesn't change anything because really, of course, the restaurant owners and all that have changed in the meantime. So we probably don't want to spend too much time on that. But the landscape is still the same. And that's what matters in this area.
I know it's really cool, too. The people are the same, too.
Probably.
Well, just phenomenally friendly people. It's just the fact that, like, for example, I got hopelessly lost trying to get to Grasse. TomTom was still very much in its nascent years as a GPS system. And I turned off the autoroute at Cagnes-sur-Mer. And oh my goodness, we wound up in some really, really back little residential streets and stuff. It was, they say that, people follow their GPS right into the river. Well, I believe it can happen. Anyway, so, I'm getting myself extricated from some of these neighborhoods, just a friendly wave. And I must admit, a maple leaf in the back window of the car didn't hurt, just to sort of indicate that, hey, I'm a foreigner here. But yeah, people were super friendly. And one of them even tried to invite us over for lunch. And
wow.
It was kind of like, no, we've got a destination. Thanks very much. And we went to Grasse. And if I can start by talking a little bit about Grasse, I know that Elise has spoken about Grasse, but what I found really interesting was it's the perfume center of the world in some ways. It certainly was where it started. So we wound up, it's kind of like, hey, Dad, there's a perfumery over there that makes perfume. And we were there just at the harvest of lavender. So there's lavender everywhere. We were so lucky. I hadn't planned on it. I didn't know. It just happened. So we went to one of these places and we did the tour and we learned about how Grasse used to be a leather works place. And this was where the gloves for the King of France and the nobility were made. And perfume was used to make the leather less objectionable for the royals. And then after the revolution, all of a sudden, there was no more market for these high-end gloves. So all of these people turned to marketing and, to use a very French term, democratizing perfumes so that people started to wear them essentially as an accessory on their person rather than on their leather goods, which nobody could afford anyway. So that was really how modern Grasse really got its start.
Yeah.
And from there, we just, once I got to Grasse, it was pretty easy because I just simply followed the departmental route, which is 6085. I'm seeing on the map now. I think they changed it. I think it was 4085 when I did it 10 years ago. But at any rate, I just followed the signs and that got us through Castellane and then up into the hills that way. And just unbelievable.
This is the sort of route that, of course, if you rent a bike, it's really on a motorcycle or on a bike, it would be even better than in a car, I think. But a car really is plenty nice. It's just a gorgeous part of the country, honestly.
Well, yeah, bike is great if you're athletic and can do some of these unbelievably steep hills. The road, by North American standards, and I think probably we should remind people that this is not some wide open highway like we have, like you had back down in Utah and I have in sort of Western Canada.
Yeah.
We're talking twisty, narrow roads. And there's one little section even where you had to use your horn to warn cars coming the other way that you're coming around a blind corner. It's really twisty, challenging driving. So you're not going anywhere in a hurry, for sure. So I don't know, cycling, yes, but I think you've got to be an advanced cyclist to do a road like this.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, this is Tour de France territory, so they go there because it's really challenging.
You'll do better if you have a yellow maillot.
Yes, absolutely. So tell us about some of the places that you enjoy most along this road, the places that stick out to you.
Well, to be honest, I'm a bit of a driver, so I did it as much for the drive as anything else. But the area around Castellane was really impressive. We stopped there probably for an hour or two. We didn't quite make it to the top, but there's Notre-Dame du Roc, which it overlooks Castellane.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this little chapel that's right on top of what must be one solid hunk of granite, one of those outposts from the Catholic Church from medieval times or even before. So, very remote. And the beautiful stone bridge that you take to get there. And then we stopped in Castellane just for a little while, but then we carried on. And the vistas as you climb back up the other side of the valley, where we stopped several times and took in the view. Just magnificent.
Yeah, you have to pull over a lot. If you have a good spot where you can pull over, I think it's important to take the time because people tend to rush too much, but I do it too.
I agree. When you say on your podcast, sometimes people try to fit too much in. I promise you, I'm screaming in the background going, yes, Annie, I completely agree. Like for us, this was a drive. According to Google, it's supposed to be a 2.5-hour drive from Grasse to the town that we stayed in that night, which was Montagnac-Montpezat, right on the plateau de Valensole. And it took us 5 hours, just sort of toddling along and having a good time. Apart from the destination, we had nothing planned for the day. Right? And it didn't help, as I say, it didn't help that I got hopelessly lost somewhere between Cagnes-sur-Mer and Grasse. So I did have a bit of a deadline. But once we got up onto the plateau, everything, like time stopped when we got to the Plateau de Valensole because it was nothing but lavender and sunflowers for as far as the eye could see. I was stunned at the view and the aroma. So that kind of then took over the day. And by then it was getting to be dusk. So we didn't have a lot of time that day on that trip getting to the bed and breakfast that we stayed at. That ultimately was the high point of the day, was when we got there.
So let's make it clear that the high point to see the lavender and the sunflower is going to be July. So depending on the year, it's going to be, because all of these plants, they have their prime moment and then they're not quite as good. I mean, like all flowers. So if you want to catch prime moment, you need to be there very late June into very late July. And exactly what day, it just depends. What do you think is the optimal time?
They harvested the lavender, pretty much all of it, on the same day. And that was the 13th of July.
Ah, yeah.
And in speaking with a couple of people around in that neighborhood, they said that it had been a particularly warm year that year, so they were able to do the harvest a little bit earlier than usual. But if I wanted to see it again, I definitely would be planning on the first week of July, absolutely, as pretty much
peak
getting
time.
To be the best peak time. That's right. But it's too early for any harvesting pretty much, but you can't be sure anytime after that. Literally gone overnight.
Yes, the sunflower, they don't get harvested right away. They are left to dry on the stalks and they don't get harvested until November, but they look really awful. After their prime, they don't really look good. They look like a gray, brown stalk, dry stalk. It's not interesting. So, you have to get there at prime time, and usually around the 15th of July is prime time for sunflowers as well. That's when they are big and bright and beautiful. And then as the season wears on, they're going to dry out more and more, which is what they want because they want to harvest the dry seeds. So that's why they leave them on the stalk to dry completely. And then they harvest them, when they get around to it in October or November, before it starts raining.
Funny how
the
birds don't eat the sunflowers. I don't know if you do that in Toulouse, but here we put sunflower heads out so that they can eat the seeds.
Yes. Oh, and the birds do. Yeah, they really do. I walk through agricultural fields every day, and you see different sorts of birds coming depending on what the farmer is doing. So they like different things, but there's lots of birds in those fields.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things about the lavender that really, it's hard to transmit this, and one doesn't usually think about this, but not only do you have that scent, that aroma, lavender is really a form of sage. So it's got a real sage smell that just the air is just thick with the smell of sage. The sound of the bees, there's a drone across the whole plateau because, of course, they've got the bees out there doing their thing. And it just transports you to a different place.
Yes.
It really is amazing, the sound. And it's everywhere. It's omnipresent. And then, of course, you have the cigales on top of that. It's just, the soundscapes are just something that you don't get.
We don't have a lot of cyclical cicadas in France, because in America you have kind of varieties of cicadas that don't come back for 5 years or 7 years or something, and they always do stories about those. But in France we have the cicadas that come back every year, like every season. So it's not as exciting.
Canada, we don't have them at all. We have grasshoppers.
It's too cold, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's an incredible soundscape, especially if you don't have that. While we were there, we stayed at a fantastic little bed and breakfast. Can I mention it?
Yes, of course. Hopefully it's still there. We don't know. It's been a long time.
It is. The same people. I've done a little bit of research. The same lovely, lovely sisters from Switzerland, actually. They're still there. It's called La Maison du Bois Doré. Mm-hmm. And it's at the end of a gravel road about 10 minutes outside of Montagnac-Montpezat. And that's just up the road from Ailes. Fantastic little spot. Anyway, they were super. We showed up right at dinner time. We were starving, my dad and I, and we hadn't made arrangements, for them to make dinner, but they offered to make dinner. They made dinner, and the ingredients were fresh. The flavors just exploded in my mouth. And that's that thing about European cuisine and French cuisine and, Italian cuisine. Just everything is not. In North America, everything you buy from a supermarket's been dumbed down. Like a tomato tastes like cardboard, but a tomato in France smells like a tomato across the room. And the flavors just explode. I'm sorry, I'm salivating at this thought. Anyway, it was those lovely hosts that recommended that we go to Musee Saint-Marie. And that was the touchstone with that previous podcast. So we had been to Musee Saint-Marie and had driven down the super twisty little roads to get there and hiked right up to the chapel. Just a phenomenal little place. Terrific little place. The faience there is great too. I know that you've had talk about faience. So if anybody's interested in porcelain and the painting on porcelain, Musee Saint-Marie is actually a destination for that. So that was a phenomenal experience too.
And this is the sort of village where you spend 2-3 hours tops, because it's really not that big. I mean, it's a village. You can visit the stores if they're open when you happen to go by. When I write itineraries for people, I tell them sometimes all I have to say is the name of the place, because once you get there, it'll be self-explanatory what to do. It'll be obvious. You have this beautiful village with beautiful streets and little shops and a few, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 places where you can have some food or drinks, but that's it. So there's not like a need to check the very best boulangerie in Musee Saint-Marie. There's one and it's good. That's it,
Yeah, that's right.
Because if it was bad, he would have gone out of business. That's it, You don't need to do a ton of research on these places. You just need to know the ones that you want to stop at and the ones that you can skip. That's important. So that's why it's good to have you on the podcast, because you've been and you can tell us.
And you're bang on. We went there for lunch and did the hike and looked in a few shops. You don't have to buy anything, but you walk in, bonjour, you have that little connection with folks in the shops, in the restaurant, on the streets. You sort of navigate all of the other tourists that happen to be there at the same time. Mm-hmm. And then you beat a hasty retreat. You can move on to something else. And usually that just means go and find another place to sit and have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or whatever happens to, slake your thirst with, right? And just to sort of give you a sense of what we did, I think we spent 3 days in Nice, maybe 4, and we went to Saint-Jacques-Cap-Ferrat, we went to the Villa Frucy, and, I showed my dad some of the places that I had been when I was there in 2000. And then we went to Antibes and then took the car and we did this trip. We went to Ailes on the last day on this part of the trip, and it was market day. So we were there for market day, and, the usual roaming market that's there every random Monday or Tuesday or whatever it happens to be, and had a really, really great time. And then the next day we went down to take the TGV up to Paris, because on my bucket list, I wanted to be in Paris for La Fête Nationale, for Bastille Day. I drove down to Ailes and dropped the car off at the TGV station. And I know on Facebook that there was a question about this recently. The TGV station, and correct me if I'm wrong, it serves Ailes as well as Marseille. So it's sort of plunked right in the middle of a field somewhere. It's very purpose-built. So you drop your car off and it's just a few hundred feet right onto the platform, if my memory serves me correct.
I haven't been to that TGV station, but this happens a lot in France, where they build a TGV station because these are completely different rails. They have to be rated for higher speeds, and so they have to build whole new rails. And sometimes it's possible to make those rails go into an existing station if it was big enough, but sometimes they might as well just build a separate station for the TGV. So sometimes you have 2-3 kilometers, sometimes up to 10, between the traditional train station. And I know this happens in Avignon as well. There's Avignon, you have the city center train station, and you have the TGV train station. And there's about 6-7 kilometers between the two. There's plenty, usually public transportation between the two. There's going to be buses. Sometimes they have a tram. It just depends on the city. And there's always taxis, obviously. But yes, train stations are sometimes dedicated to TGV, and that happens quite a bit.
So we got on the TGV, and this was my dad's first time. He was like a kid in a candy store, just sitting back and watching us fly past the cars that were on the autoroute right next to us. And as a tip, I always like to share with people this particular tip, because I remember when I was younger and traveling around France that you can get a lot of school groups riding on the trains, and school groups, kids are lovely and their energy is amazing, but it can get a little bit tiring after a while. When I take the TGV, I always try to find a TGV that's a duplex, because then you have 2 floors. And a lot of the TGV lines, especially when you're going through urban or semi-urban areas, they have sound barriers in order to keep the surrounding neighborhoods quiet from the rushing trains. But the duplexes are just a little bit higher, so you can actually see over these sound barriers. So that, in my view, the view is better. And then you choose the quiet room, the coach that is termed the quiet one. So then the groups generally sit somewhere else. At least that's my experience.
Okay, so I haven't run in, I don't remember if you can choose a quiet room now, but typically if you take a first class ticket, there's going to be fewer groups, because if there's a school group or families with lots of kids, they usually don't pay extra for first class. So that's what I usually do. And if you take first class, when you book the tickets, at least with the French app, with the SNCF Connect app, you can choose your seat specifically. You can kind of decide, where you want to be. And is there a quiet? I don't remember seeing that, but I always get first class and make sure that I'm in a place isolée, is what they call it in French. So that's like you don't have anybody sitting next to you, is what it is. Because I'm always working on my laptop and I just don't like having people look over at what I'm doing. So I just choose the place isolée, and that means it's just your wide seat, then the hallway,
The aisle.
The aisle, yes, that's the right word. And then you have 2 seats after that on the other side.
Maybe my dad didn't travel in first class. Darn, I'll have to take him back and we'll do first class next time.
First class is really nice. It's good. The thing about going upstairs, it's good, but if you have reduced mobility, it can be a problem because the stairs are kind of higher than normal by a little bit, by an inch or two, but it makes a difference. If you have reduced mobility, it's harder. And when the train is moving up above on top, you have more motion. So if you have motion sickness, probably the bottom floor would be better. But,
Yeah, but Annie, we're talking about motion, more motion on a TGV. Don't compare that to an American or a Canadian train. Don't. There's still, you can still put a coin on its edge and put it on the table and it's not going to fall over. It's still an incredibly smooth, silent, spectacular ride. Yes, there's a little bit more motion if you're going through switches and stuff like that, track switches and everything, but it's marginal. But yeah, if you tend to have issues with motion sickness, you're 100% right. And I won't disagree with you on that.
Yeah. And the thing that's important also to remember is that if you get the TGV, you pick your seat. And I like to pick a seat where I can see, because you store your luggage there's an area that's designed for storing suitcases. And you can see it from where you are if you pick it right. Maybe you'll have your back to it. So you just have to see the train is going to be like from where I'm going to sit. They show you how the seat is arranged because they can be in either direction. Some people prefer to face the direction of the train. Others prefer to face the other way. Whatever. There's a ton of choices on trains that you don't have on airplanes,
One of the things that I have read and is obviously a concern for people is the security of their suitcases and how they might disappear. One of the things I might suggest, and you can usually get these in travel shops everywhere, you can get really, really fine cable locks. Uh-huh. And you can actually lock your suitcase to the rack.
I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, right? You can.
Then you don't have to worry about it. The suitcase is there and it's secure. And you can buy them. What's really cool is I have one that's retractable. So it comes in a little case that's probably about a little bit thicker but about the same size as a cell phone. And it's a combination lock, so you don't have to worry about keys and stuff like that. And you just pull it out. I think there's 3, maybe 4 feet of cable. Mm-hmm. And you just loop it through the handle of your suitcase and loop it through the bar that's part of the structure of the shelving for all the suitcases. And you just lock it in. It's locked. It's there. Your case isn't going anywhere.
That's an excellent suggestion because I have a thing like that, but I use it for my bike helmet, to tie my bike helmet to my bike so I don't have to carry it with me. I could use it for the suitcase, definitely. What I do usually is I tie some sort of obnoxious ribbon or something with a bright color so I can see it easily at a distance. And I've never had a problem with people taking anything, especially if you travel first class.
I've never heard anybody, and this even goes back to when I was backpacking in Europe in the 90s. I never heard of anything disappearing. It just doesn't happen. I mean, it probably does, but, it's so rare.
Yeah. Worry about the stuff that happens and not so much about the stuff that never happens, because then you don't go anywhere. If you start worrying about all things that could happen, might happen, but don't, then you get afraid and you don't go anywhere.
You might as well stay home.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole point. It's the excitement that you have to deal with. Like, for example, here's an example. When we were in Nice, I put my bank card into the bank machine. I'm not going to tell you the bank. That's not fair. But, I requested 100 euros and the machine gave me 50.
Oh.
So you talk about how the French love their bureaucracy. Well, the next day, and it's not just the government, the next day I went back to that branch, that very, very branch where they had to have audited the machine. And I said, here's the slip. Here's my request for 100 euros, and here's the 50 euro bill I got out of the machine. And it was the better part of a day dealing with that.
Yeah.
And, and guess what? Eventually, that particular bank did not give me my 50 euros. It was my home bank back in Canada that said, well, you clearly was taken out of the account and you're pretty insistent that this money never wound up in your pocket. So here, we'll give you 50 euros, if only just to shut you up.
Yeah, this is really hard to prove, isn't it?
It boils down to them doing an audit and then believing that 50 euros was in fact yours. And the French, being the French, the way that they sort of work, you're right. You absolutely have to be able to prove, like you have to basically film the machine spitting out the money, missing the 50 euros each time. As a lesson, I have learned, I don't know how the bank machines work, but even here in Canada, if I take money out of a bank machine, I will discreetly wave all the bills in front of the machine, in front of the camera, so that like straight out of the machine, so that they can hear the machine, they know what the machine is doing, and they can then that way maybe one day I can go check the cameras because it's missing one of the bills. I don't know if it would work, but anyway, it's one of those weird things, those little habits you collect as you move on in years.
I've heard of such things happening rarely, but it's not impossible. So yeah, you do have to be careful, just like I use contactless purchases all the time. I always ask for the receipt and I always briefly check, I just paid 34 euros or whatever. They charge me 34 euros because they could add a zero by mistake because it doesn't go into the teller's pocket. They just made a mistake and punched it in wrong.
And that can happen anywhere.
So yeah, be a little careful with your transactions. Be purposeful. Pay attention instead of just, whatever, yeah.
So that leads us to Paris and the next day, which was La Fête Nationale. And I just want to, we're going to talk about some of the things that shoulda, woulda, couldas in just a minute. I was there for Paris for the Bastille Day. And it was, I was very happy that I was there. The weather was fantastic. The energy in the city was fantastic. Down in Place de la Concorde, they had the reviewing stands all ready to go because we showed up the night before. So we looked at all of the reviewing stands, knowing what was going to be there. And the next day, the crowds along the Champs-Élysées were just unbelievable. So we actually wound up just off the Place de la Concorde, right against Palais Bourbon, right against the fence. So the parade, they come down the Champs-Élysées, they go past the reviewing stands, they turn right, they go across the bridge, and then past the Assemblée Nationale at the Palais Bourbon, and then they disperse. So we were there right at the very end of the actual parade. And what was really cool was, they were starting to sort of break up a little bit. They were still formal, but not really. So it was, you got some of that super formality. And then the spouses were coming and meeting their husbands who were, finished their 5-mile walk, and all of that kind of stuff was starting to happen. So it was a really fun mix of genuine people with all of the pomp and circumstance.
Yeah, it's a good spot. Yes.
And 2012 was notable because it was actually the very first time since the Second World War that there was actually serving German soldiers walking down the Champs-Élysées. And so they were part of a group of 6. It was a very small contingent, but it did I remember reading it in the paper that it, made the news that they were going to be there. Very symbolic. But Annie, one of the things that I noticed as we were driving the day before to get to the TGV station to take the train were all of the little towns all along the way were all getting ready for La Fête. Mm-hmm. And so my experience, having now been to Paris to do Bastille Day in Paris, where we were at the Eiffel Tower for the fireworks and we were there for the parade, was there are lots of big formal things that go on. But I even went to l'Office de Tourisme, to the tourism office in Paris, and asked them, okay, can you tell me about where are some of the little local things that are going on? Paris doesn't have any because it's all about the big national show in Paris. So I would like to go back to France and be in provincial France, outside in the countryside, in the smaller towns, to see what it is like to be in a small town for the national holiday, because I think it would be a very different, more organic experience. It would be, I think, a very different experience.
Yeah, I live in a village, and what they do in my village, it's a village of, I think, not quite 3,000 yet. And there's other villages nearby, it's not like we're in the boonies or whatever. But in our village, they usually do the mayor, and we happen to have a marching band in the village. It's one of the associations they have their rehearsals and all that in the village. And so they usually march. And actually, that's the music I use for the closing song of the podcast. I recorded my local marching band playing. They march and they will have some flowers, and there's usually a short speech, but it's not very much But they do it every year. They do something every year. And it takes, half an hour, maybe. It's not a very long thing. And there's often also a kind of village meal that gets announced. And it's somewhere between the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, because it just depends on the day of the week that the 14th falls on. So you can join that village and, you have to reserve your spot. And in France, in those village things, you have to bring your own utensils, plates and cups and everything, because they won't give you disposable anything.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, no disposable anything. So if you go to a village event, remember to bring I actually have a set of plastic cups, bowls, and whatever for that purpose, because by the time you've had your meal at the village thing, you've had a little bit of drink and you might forget your utensils. And don't ask me how I know this. And you will never find them again, because whoever is catering is just going to just clear up and throw it all. So don't bring anything precious, but no plastic utensils. You will be looked at like you are an alien from space. Never mind that we used to all use plastic utensils 10 years ago, but no more. So you have to bring your own washable plates, cups, utensils.
Okay. So in other words, before Bastille Day, we have to find a flea market and we have to find something where we can get ourselves a cup, a plate, a fork, and a knife and a spoon.
Yeah, it's the camping stuff, like the
Perfect.
Kind of a camping store, the type of stuff you'll find at a camping store. It's good enough to be reused repeatedly.
And you probably... Can you find that like in the local Monoprix, or obviously you could in Carrefour, but in your Monop?
I'm not sure. I bought mine at a camping store. I don't think they would have that quality, because it's like a grade of plastic that's made to be reused. Unbreakable, reusable type of things. We're strange in France. We have our oddities.
Oh yes, but that's what makes you so lovely and French.
And we keep growing new ones every year.
I was just thinking, Annie, that, again, as I read the Facebook comments and stuff, there's people who want to pack so much into such a little time.
Yeah.
This particular trip that we did was, like I say, I think it was I've got it here. 3 nights in Nice. Then we had 2 nights in Montagnac-Montpezat. And then we had 4 nights in Paris. So that's 3, 5, 9. So that was 10 days plus travel time to do 3 locations.
Yeah.
And the Montagnac-Montpezat, we had no plans. It was just, let's drive the route, let's enjoy the scenery, let's see what's there when we get there. And the same thing, Nice, I had a couple of things that I wanted to do with my dad and show him some things, because he's an avid gardener. So I really thought that going up to the Villa Frusi would be fantastic. It would be kind of like, that part of the world's version of the Butcher Gardens, which we have here over in Victoria. And then in Paris, the only thing for me was I would really like to be a part of the Bastille celebrations. And then my dad is one of these fantastic person to travel with. If you need someone to travel with, then maybe my dad will go with you, because he's game for anything. And, it's like, well, do you have anything you want to do? No, I'll go wherever you want to go. And the only thing he suggested he wanted to do was actually go parasailing off right in the Baie des Anges, right off the Promenade des Anglais.
Yes.
It was like my dad, he's 30 years older than I am, and he's the one that's got the chutzpah to do that. So we did that. And that was just before we got in the car and started our drive to Grasse. And now that I think about it, we didn't even leave Nice until after noon. I think we had lunch before we actually left.
Wow.
Because, no set itinerary. We'll get there when we get there kind of thing. And it was relaxed. And yeah, for the work that I did, it was, when I got back to Canada, I was, I wasn't exhausted. We'd had a long flight, but, for us from Paris or from London, it's 8 hours. So you get back to Vancouver, and my dad still had another hour to fly to get back to where he lives. But for me, I was charged and ready to go. I wasn't exhausted at all because everything had been paced out.
And, the other thing that, sorry to interrupt, but the other thing that is important for people to remember is they're coming to France. They're not going to the moon. So there will be everything you need. It's not like you need to plan every little detail. It's actually counterproductive to plan every little detail. Now, I think in a city like Paris, and that's why I so enjoy writing voice map tours, it's good to have kind of a structure a path that you're going to follow because it will take you to all the interesting bits. But it's the same with this Napoleon route. You followed a specific path because you knew it was going to be beautiful and enjoyable. But then the pace at which you do it doesn't really matter. You don't need to be anywhere specific at any specific time. There will be cafes along the way. There will be things to stop at. There will be museums. At least in Paris, there will be museums for sure. There will be things for you to do, and you don't really need to get all like hyper planner on, like, oh, my next stop is in 15 minutes. I must go. Just take it slow, take it easy. There will be plenty of things to do. But this is a problem because if you're listening to this podcast, obviously you're someone who likes to hear about France and you're probably a little bit of an over planner. So just chill and understand that you're coming to France. You're not going to the Serengeti. You don't need to plan every minute of the day. It's fine. You will see stuff where you want to stop, where you want to look at it because it's cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do want to talk about your voice map tours because I've actually downloaded them and listened to them virtually. And Annie, I've been to Paris. I think I've been to Paris 12 times now. And, I've just sort of wandered around and I spent a whole week in Montmartre with Dad, for example. I downloaded the Montmartre tour the other day and was listening to it and I've learned a lot. Yeah. I've been to all of those places that you talked about, but, we're walking up the street and there's a sculpture of a man emerging from the wall. What's that about? Well, that's really cool. And then you move on. But now I know the story behind that.
Yeah, there's a book.
Yeah, but you've given us the thumbnail, the Reader's Digest version of the Coles Notes version, right? But that's phenomenal. And that's the thing about the voice map tours is you get a little taste of really what's there and why. And the whole story about the Chevalier, I don't remember, Chevalier Labarre, that is tragic stuff.
Yes.
But I remember walking through that little park going, well, that's a nice sculpture. And,
who's this guy with his hat? Yeah.
But now I know.
Yeah.
And so the next time I go back, I'm going to see Montmartre and Île de la Cité and Le Marais. And, for me, Le Marais is all about gay Paris, to be quite honest with you. But, all of the other things about, I knew it was also the Jewish quarter and all of those things, but the history of les hôtels particuliers that you talk about and their restoration and their purpose and all of that other, la bibliothèque.
Yeah.
I'm going back to the bibliothèque. I didn't know about the bibliothèque. That's just around the corner from my favorite bar in the Marais.
That's the thing about the way I do this is because I really love French history and I read a lot of books. I've always been a bookworm and I continue to be a bookworm. And I read a lot of books that would just utterly bore people to tears. But out of these books, I grab the bits that are really fascinating and I tie them to the place. And that's why voice map is ideal because there's no better way to see an area, I think, than being walked to a place and told a little bit about it. Not a long lecture, not a full book that might bore you to tears, but just that little spice, that little extra. And the one thing I don't like about the way a lot of tour guides work is that they would rather tell you some silly story that has no historical significance. I like to go find the stories that have a bit of historical significance.
I couldn't agree with you more. I used to be a tour guide, the typical bus tours. This was of the Canadian Rockies. And sometimes it was really sad. There's so much good stuff to talk about. And, I ran into a tour guide one day who literally said to me, to my face, why let the facts get in the way of a good story?
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, that's so trite. People have spent a lot of money and a lot of time to come and you're serving them drivel. And I got to say, that's not what you're putting out. That's some quality stuff, Annie. That's an endorsement from an old tour guide, if I can.
Thank you. But, it's because I really love French history.
And it shows.
And I like to bring it into the real world. And, if you saw my everyday life, you would see that what I do, I walk my dog every day. And while walking my dog, I actually listen to books the same way blind people listen to books. Your phone can read you books. So these are books that I buy on Kindle that never get made into an audiobook because they don't have enough reach, But I listen to them while I walk around and I wonder what the people around me are thinking, like, what is this woman doing? Because sometimes I don't put it in earbuds, and I'm like, they probably think I'm crazy because I just walk my dog listening to all this historical stuff.
Every village has to have a crazy person.
There you go. But that's how I get through so many books, and it's a very good way to do it for me. But I understand that most people don't want to do that, and that's fine. They don't need to, because I will just bring the salty bits, but not the made up bits. I don't make up anything. And I really, really don't like it when tour guides get obsessed about someone had a meal in this place. Like, who cares? Like, yes, famous people ate here. The end. There is nothing else to say. Of course they ate. Of course, we all do. Like, it does not make this cafe extra special. It just makes it a place that was convenient for people to come have, socialize and have some meals or whatever. So that makes the neighborhood interesting. So let's talk about why this neighborhood was interesting. But instead, they just talk about, famous person ate at this cafe. No, whatever. But that's just me. But anyway, so lots and lots to see in the Napoleon route and beyond. But I just wanted to give people put a bug in their ear that there's a way to organize your trip around this historical event, this walk that Napoleon did. And if you do, you will see some really, really beautiful places in Provence.
It's super not touristy. It's Provence, but it's not touristy. Yeah. If you go back into the back country that way. And it's a perfect way to do that. Hey, Annie, can I just throw one last thing out for you, just to sort of share? And that has to do with the fact that it kind of helps from my perspective that I lived in France for a while, so back in the 90s. And that is that the impression when I talk to people who have not been to France is they're all very concerned about how snooty and unfriendly French people are. And I always share with them, and this is a great platform to do this, so I hope you'll indulge me. In my experience, there are really two Frances. There's Paris, and then there's everywhere else. And for me, I cannot, in good conscience, go to Paris without going outside of the city some distance, going to some other place in France. So I have to divide my visits to France always in two. And I can't go to anywhere out in Provence without, that'd be anywhere outside of Paris without spending some time in Paris as well, because there's something just so incredibly vital about that. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is oftentimes, and this was my experience, people, oh, yeah, I've been to Toronto, therefore I've been to Canada. No. It doesn't work that way. And it's the same as it is when you go to Paris, and people have this impression that Parisians are cold and unfriendly. But you have to realize that Paris is the center of the Francophone world in the same way that New York is the center pretty much of the Anglophone world. Well, maybe London, shares that. Yeah. But at the end of the day, if you're a tourist and you're banging around in the middle of the Châtelet-les-Halles train station with 3 suitcases and 2 kids in tow, and you have no idea where you're going, somebody is going to get upset with you because you're in their way. And the same thing, they're not going to appreciate if you just waltz right up to them and ask them where the nearest bathroom is, just as somebody in New York who's busy with 95 things on their mind isn't going to appreciate the same thing someone coming up to them in a foreign language and asking them where the nearest toilet is. So just kind of bear that in mind, that there's a time and a place to be touristy, and the tourist office is a good place, and you'll never find a grumpy person in a tourist office. At least that's my experience. Yeah. But then finally, my impression, having lived in France, is that the people who live outside of Paris don't particularly like the people who live in Paris. And the people who live in Paris don't really like much of anything. That's just kind of an impression that I have. It's a generalization, of course. But at the end of the day, that's why I think that there are two Frances. And if you're going to go and spend a couple of weeks in France, 5 or 6 days in Paris will do all the highlights. But then get out, go, take a train. That's my preferred method of travel. Take a train, go to Lyon, which in my opinion is just as much Paris, except it's a lot cleaner and a lot slower. Or Go to Toulouse, go to Nice, go to Nancy. I have not been to the northwest of France myself. But go to Strasbourg, go break it up so that you get a little bit of a more broader impression and experience of what it is to be French, to be in France, to experience the world through the eyes of French people.
And in French, we have the expression la province. So we've been talking about Provence, and I'm not sure if you can hear the difference. Provence, la Provence is a region. But when in French we say la province with an I, so it's Province, that means everywhere but Paris. So in English, if you think about it, you don't have a word for everywhere but Toronto or everywhere but London.
We do, because Canada is divided into 10 provinces.
Well, yeah, but do you have a word that means like...
Everywhere else? No.
Everywhere else, right. But we do in French. In French, it's province, la province. You can say, oh, je vais en province. And that means I'm leaving Paris. I'm exiting Paris. And Parisians say this all the time. And to them, there's Paris and there's outside of Paris. Just like you put it. And it's an important concept because in France, we even have this idea that Paris is utterly different from the rest of the country. And it is. But if you're going to go out on the train to go explore one area of Provence outside of Paris, make it one area. If you only have a week, 10 days,
exactly.
You cannot go around to all these areas because you will see nothing. So pick one. On this trip, I'm going to go explore the Strasbourg area, or I'm going to explore Lyon. I'm going to explore Nice. I'm going to explore Bordeaux, Toulouse. You could go to Rennes. Just pick an area and explore that for a few days. Don't try to do Dordogne, Provence, Loire Valley, Normandy beaches, all in 10 days. You will drive yourself crazy and you won't have a good time. So don't do it.
And you'll be exhausted. You'll need a vacation after your holiday.
Don't do it. Yep. Brian, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been a delight, and congratulate you on your wonderful French. Bravo, bravo. C'est très bien.
Merci. Merci.
And hopefully you'll keep listening to the podcast, and we'll continue to contribute on the Facebook group as well, because that's really important to have people who understand France to the level that you do.
Thank you very much. And Annie, just to say, I had been looking for a podcast and for Facebook pages like this, and I don't know how it wound up finally on my feed sometime in the last year, but you popped up and you are a gem.
Oh,
I am so thrilled that I've come across you, that I've come to know you a little bit through all of these podcasts. You and Lise. Lise is amazing.
Yeah,
amazing. We can't leave her out of this picture because she tells some fantastic stories.
Yep.
And it's just an absolute joy to just be transported sometimes to the places that you guys talk about and the history that you're able to transmit in a way that's understandable and enjoyable. And that's the key part too. So thank you very much. I don't know. I think that frankly, one day you should maybe be in Légion d'honneur.
Oh, you're too kind, but probably not.
I think you're good. The president you wanted got reelected, which I'm really happy for. And at the end of the day, I think he should write you a letter. I do.
Thank you, Brian. And hopefully next time you have a wonderful trip to France and go explore some other place, you'll tell us about it as well.
I'd be delighted to. I sure will. Thank you very much for that.
Merci. Au revoir.
Merci. Au revoir.
The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2022 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.